Professor Wen Guanzhong on the institutional roots of the U.S.-China trade war. Today I want to share something that really struck me recently. It's an interview with a Chinese economist, Professor Wen Guanzhong. He's an emeritus professor at Trinity College in Connecticut and one of the few Chinese economists with deep insight into China's institutional system. His areas of expertise include institutional economics, land systems, globalization, and U.S.-China economic relations, especially the nature of China's state capitalism. His views are sharp, straightforward, and real. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at the ongoing U.S.-China trade conflict from the perspective of someone who deeply understands both systems. Professor Wen's central argument is clear. This isn't just about tariffs on the surface. It's a deeper structural clash rooted in fundamental institutional asymmetries. Especially after Trump introduced the reciprocal tariffs policy, many saw it as a signal for full U.S.-China decoupling. So what's the real logic behind it? We're not here to sensationalize. Let's follow how Professor Wen unpacks it, step by step. Professor Wen said a lot of people saw Trump's tariffs as a bargaining chip. But in reality, it was a signal of a much bigger institutional shift. He explained that Trump wasn't acting in isolation. He represented an internal correction mechanism of the U.S. system in response to worsening global economic pressures. America's national debt has been getting heavier and heavier, and the trade deficit keeps growing every year. From an economic standpoint, this trend just isn't sustainable. Trump simply brought the issue to the forefront using a more confrontational approach. He didn't follow the WTO framework of most favored nation treatment. Instead, he went unilateral, saying each country would be judged separately. If you have a big trade surplus with the U.S., you get hit with higher tariffs. If you're on good terms with the U.S. and keep it happy, you get tax reductions. That may sound like tactical maneuvering, but Professor Wen said it's not that simple. It actually marks a full institutional departure from the old belief in global trade symmetry. And especially toward China, the U.S. wasn't just demanding fair trade in goods. It was questioning the legitimacy of China's entire economic system. China grew rapidly under an asymmetric system. It benefited from global openness, but didn't move towards symmetrical institutional reform. That asymmetry, Wen says, is what the U.S. is trying to respond to with the tariff war. Wen's not saying China hasn't benefited. Quite the opposite. He said the last 40 years of reform and opening up really did improve lives for ordinary people. He shared his own observation from rural China. Places where he once did manual labor are now totally transformed. Back in the 80s, a migrant worker could make more in 1 month in the city than they could in a whole year on the farm. But reform got stuck midway, especially after Xi Jinping came to power. Instead of advancing market reforms, China has been moving backwards, expanding state control while private enterprise shrinks. This reversal has caused serious distortions in all factor markets: land, capital, and labor. Take land, for instance. In China, land ownership isn't truly private. If the government supports your business, you get land. If not, they can take it away. Look at Huawei. It's not publicly listed, it doesn't disclose financing, and yet it can roll out 5G infrastructure across the globe. How could that happen without government backing? That wouldn't fly in the West. Then there's the hukou, or household registration system. Wen strongly criticizes this system that ranks people in tiers. In the U.S., people live wherever they want. But in China, if a migrant worker brings their kid to the city, they face problems getting access to schools, healthcare, and social services. Without a city hukou, you're not even considered a resident. These aren't technical issues, they're systemic. And that, Wen says, is the real root of the U.S.-China trade conflict. Trump's reciprocal tariffs idea, introduced in 2016, might seem like just a trade tactic. But according to Wen, it was actually an attempt to pressure China to change its system. In Trump's first term, the two countries signed a deal, China agreed to buy more American agricultural goods. But when the agreement went back to Beijing, all sections involving reforms to China's economic system were crossed out in red pen. Wen reflects on that moment with some sadness. He said when China joined the WTO, the West had high hopes. China had promised to complete market reforms within 15 years and become a real market economy. But by 2016, the US and EU officially revoked China's market economy status. It was clear to them, China hadn't progressed, it had regressed. And with that institutional imbalance, Wen argues, globalization becomes deeply unfair. It forces market economies to compete with a player that distorts prices through subsidies and state control. That's not a fair game. Not every country should be treated the same, Wen insists. If a country protects human rights, has functioning labor unions, a social welfare system, and retirement security, then its product prices are more reflective of real costs. But China doesn't. Its land, labor, capital, and cultural goods are all under government control. That's why Chinese prices on the global market are artificially low. Wen even gave a practical example. When using reciprocal tariffs, the U.S. shouldn't use China's reported export prices as benchmarks. Instead, they should look to another developing country with more normal institutions, like Brazil, and use Brazil's prices as the basis to determine whether China is dumping products. He made it crystal clear, the U.S. must change its mindset. It shouldn't apply tariffs equally across the board. It should consider the institutional nature of the partner. If they're a market economy, talk reciprocal. If they're not, if their system is distorted, then hit them with double or even triple tariffs. WTO rules already allow for this kind of retaliatory tariff system. The U.S. can fully enforce this under Section 301. So will China be scared? Wen says, not at all. China might be the least scared country in the world when it comes to tariffs. Because the whole system relies on lies and force. It can mobilize nationalism, spin economic hardship as the fault of foreign enemies, and rally people to endure. This is a regime that can sacrifice the public's welfare to fulfill its own strategic goals. But Wen also warns, the more China rejects reform and closes off, the riskier its future becomes. Real estate is slumping, consumption is weak, government budgets are stretched. Healthcare and pensions are still not unified between urban and rural areas. Kids of migrant workers still can't access quality education. All these signs suggest the system hasn't really delivered for most Chinese people. What should the West do then? Wen says the goal is not to hurt Chinese citizens. It's to stop this system from growing stronger and spreading its own logic globally. If the West tolerates it, it's basically using the market of the free world to nourish a monster that rejects freedom. In one of the most striking parts of the interview, Wen says, globalization as we knew it is over. And this is an alarmist. He explains that old globalization relied on 3 zeros: zero tariffs, zero barriers, and zero subsidies. But that model only worked because there was a basic consensus on values and institutions. Everyone was playing by similar rules. But China no longer abides by those rules. So Wen puts it bluntly, the old global framework is dead. The U.S. now needs to build a new one. And this time, only countries with aligned values, comparable systems, and functioning market mechanisms should be allowed in. He says Western countries aren't necessarily trying to exclude China, but the Chinese system is just too weird. On the one hand, it's the biggest developing country in the world. On the other, it seals itself off, runs everything in-house, bans the open internet. It's not behaving like a globalized country. How do you deal with that? Wen gives examples. The TPP, the CPTPP, the EU, NATO, these are the beginnings of a values-based alliance. They're not trying to isolate anyone. They just want to set higher standards for cooperation. They welcome China to join, but only if it plays by the rules. Would China be willing? Based on Xi Jinping's policies in recent years, Wen doesn't think so. She is pushing the narrative that the East is rising and the West is declining. Everywhere he goes, he talks about a once-in-a-century transformation and declares our rise is inevitable. The West is fading. That's not cooperation, that's competition. Wen made a painfully honest observation. If she were to suddenly abandon that message, he'd be admitting that the last 10-plus years of his governance had failed. That's not something he can easily do. So even if the economy slows, even if real estate crashes, even if consumer spending tanks, she still has to stick to his script. We're rising, the West is in decline. And that's why China now finds itself in a strange spot. Its economy is tightening, social tensions are growing, yet it's projecting more strength and confidence abroad. At the heart of this contradiction, one says it's the system.